Once a small island nation with a booming economy, the Republic of Nauru, located in the Pacific Ocean, was famously known as the wealthiest in the world. Its history, dating back to pre-1900s, is filled with tales of abundant land and resources. But behind its seemingly idyllic state and reputation lies a dark financial crisis that brought this once mighty country to its knees in less than 3 decades. Through political turmoil and economic strife, we uncover how Nauru's history and expansive wealth transformed into one of the world's most infamous bankrupt nations. Stay tuned until the end as we uncover how an entire country can crumble in such a short amount of time. They say size doesn't matter, and Nauru proves it. This tiny island nation packs a powerful punch when it comes to lessons on economics. They were the pioneers of the most dramatic economic downturn ever seen. Don't be fooled by its small size. Nauru is full of surprises. The economies of many nations can be significantly impacted by natural resources. Consider the enormous oil wealth that several of the Persian Gulf states enjoy. However, if natural resource wealth is not properly managed, it can occasionally have a negative long-term impact. For this reason, many economists even go as far as to mention the curse of natural resources. This tiny country in the Pacific is one of the best examples of what can go wrong. The nation progressed from poverty to wealth, only returned to somehow being worse than it was before it became wealthy. Can you guess how that happened? Because it is one of the few occasions in history when we have been able to fully study the economic dynamics that drive these booms and busts on such a clear scale, the lesson of Nauru is one that all economists can learn from. So, how did Nauru get to be the richest nation on Earth? What errors did they make that caused them to waste this wealth? And finally, how did this small nation truly become worse over time? When Europeans first discovered Nauru in 1789, their eyes were captivated by its beauty. Lush palm trees swayed across a central plateau encircled by white sand beaches, a sight that inspired the British to dub it Pleasant Islands. A few decades later, outsiders settled on Nauru, an island just 1/3 the size of Manhattan. Initially, resources such as coconuts and pigs were all that was expected to be found here, until a British geologist identified higher-grade phosphate ore beneath the soil. Unfortunately, Nauru did not become oil-rich. Instead, the researchers discovered dried bird droppings and algae, which were somehow more valuable because they could be utilized primarily in fertilizers, but also as animal feed and a source of cosmetics. When it was discovered that 80% of the lovely island was rich in this mineral at the turn of the 20th century, it was a treasure trove of accumulated seabird excrement combined with marine microorganisms that had not yet been discovered. Although it may sound horrible, it was crucial for feeding a growing world population, making it of great value. Can you think of other potential applications this mineral has, aside from fertilizers, animal feed, and cosmetics? At the start of the 20th century, Germany was granted mining rights to Nauru, a small island nation. Over the next several years, nearly 80 million metric tons of phosphate were shipped from Nauru to far-off destinations. Ports, processing facilities, and supporting industries emerged on a relatively small piece of land, no bigger than Central Park in size. However, when Germany became embroiled in the First World War, Australia stepped in and seized control of Nauru. By this point, it had become an offshore mining site. The phosphate extracted from Nauru was then sold at subsidized rates, known as make rates, to farmers across Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain. By this time, Nauru's natural beauty had been drastically diminished by decades of intense mining. Descriptions of the island in National Geographic at the time painted a grim picture, contrasting sharply with its earlier nickname, Pleasant Land. But even worse was to come. During World War II, Japan invaded Nauru and inflicted terror upon its people, including labor camps and mass drownings. until only 600 Nauruans survived. When Japan surrendered, Australia resumed control of the island and carried on exploiting its phosphate reserves. Can you guess what life was like for the Nauruans who survived the war? Between 1945 and 1968, the mining of phosphate on Nauru reached staggering levels. When the Nauruans were granted independence, their economy was firmly rooted in the export of this resource. The island had seen over a third of its land taken over by mining activities, leaving a bleak and intimidating landscape. Though they were now free to choose their own course, their economic output was constricted by limited production factors. With limited land, labor, and capital, Nauru was heavily restricted in the types of industries they could sustain. Their tiny population lacked the expertise to develop any industries other than mining phosphate, a resource that had made them money, but which was still largely owned by their former colonizers. The realization that this island's phosphate reserves would run out within a lifetime spurred more intense mining activities as they searched for their share of wealth. This ushered in an era of Nauruan history where it became known as the wealthiest little island in the Pacific Ocean. With only around 10 years after independence, Nauru achieved its status as the richest country per capita in the world. Had you heard about this country prior to watching this video? In 1981, the GDP per capita of Nauru was now around $27,000, the equivalent of $88,000 today, which meant that the average Nauruan was twice as wealthy as the average American. Though not a perfect indicator of prosperity, comparing GDP per capita is still the simplest way to measure economic success. Thanks to phosphate wealth and political independence, citizens of Nauru flourished. From free education and healthcare courtesy of their government, to royalties from landowners mining phosphate, many could afford to be unemployed by choice. With newfound wealth came tales from their ports of grandeur and misadventure alike. Despite its small size, cars were a popular accessory for many citizens of Nauru. One can drive around the entire perimeter of the island in an hour, making it an unlikely spot for drag racing. Unfortunately, for one police chief, his dream of owning a Lamborghini was crushed when he realized he could not even fit behind the wheel. This issue highlights the growing obesity epidemic in Nauru at the time, with increased wealth and poor food choices resulting in dangerously high body mass indexes. Would you have indulged in a similar manner? The island's native foods, such as coconuts and fish, had been replaced by imported products, yet another consequence of phosphate mining. Poor health within the workforce had drastic economic consequences as well. It is clear that more must be done to address this obesity crisis. Let's take a closer look at Nauru's health situation then and now. On Nauru, most meals consist of instant noodles, white rice, canned food, and soda. Tobacco and binge drinking are also rampant. Anthropologist Amy McLennan observes that she was fortunate to find one vegetable a week during her stay. However, it is noteworthy that the inhabitants of Nauru remain informed on the health risks associated with their unhealthy diet and lifestyle. School programs are making an effort to promote proper nutrition. However, access to nutritious foods remains limited due to the environmental destruction caused by decades of phosphate mining. The repercussions of this, combined with the economic downturn following depletion of resources, have resulted in a situation where cheap processed foods are the only affordable option for many Nauruans. Can you imagine not eating any vegetables at all? During the colonial period, Nauruans were only able to access a small portion of the wealth created by phosphate mining. This economic necessity, rather than greed, was likely the driving force behind their decision to continue phosphate mining after independence. Unfortunately, their dependence on imports for all goods and services, including food and water, is not a sustainable model. The focus on phosphate mining has overshadowed any investment in manufacturing or agriculture. The land was too damaged from topsoil removal during mining activities anyways. This is an example of Dutch disease taken to an extreme due to Nauru's limited resources. To avoid this issue, various Middle Eastern nations actively work towards diversifying their economies. While the decision to diversify into offshore banking was not a surprise to Nauru's leaders, it quickly became clear that the strategy was questionable at best. With the requirement of only an economic citizenship in order to open an account, Nauru effectively served as a safe haven for money laundering and tax evasion. This generated millions in fees for the government, but as time went on, it became apparent that this was not a viable solution to combat their dwindling phosphate resources. In fact, it garnered so much international pressure that Nauru was labeled a rogue state under the 2001 U.S. Patriot Act. The Norwegian approach provides an alternative solution by setting up a sovereign wealth fund and investing resource wealth accordingly. Dividends can be generated for future generations. What would have happened if Nauru stopped offering offshore banking? Although the Nauruans invested earnings from their phosphate boom for future use, the strategy wasn't successful. Poor management and fraudulent behavior caused them to lose a significant amount of these investments, leaving them on the brink of bankruptcy. Even with a second phosphate rush, this could not be prevented. Ultimately, the central bank went bankrupt, leading to repossession of overseas assets and confiscation of planes. Yes, Nauru had launched their own airline in the 70s. Before we go over an even worse situation that happened to Nauru, take a sec and subscribe to our channel. We really appreciate it. In a last-ditch effort to secure financial stability, Nauru ventured into a famously ill-fated venture, the musical Leonardo the Musical: A Portrait of Love. However, the play did not bring in the revenue they had hoped for, and the country eventually found itself completely out of phosphate resources, and with millions lost from failed overseas investments. By 2001, with an adjusted GDP of just $32 million, Nauru was in dire straits. The economic plight of Nauru had once been the world's wealthiest nation was devastating. Unemployment skyrocketed to 90%, school systems mostly collapsed, and the phosphate boom that had brought so much wealth came to an abrupt end. In 2001, Australia offered a Pacific solution, an offshore detention camp on Nauru, to house migrants in exchange for payment. This kept the island economy afloat, but not without consequence. James Angamia, an old minister from the Nauru Congregational Church born in 1911, lamented, "I wish we'd never discovered that phosphate. I wish Nauru could look like it was before when I was a boy. It was so beautiful. Now, I see what's happened here, and I want to cry." We can all learn from this story about how quickly a country can fall into ruin. So, if you want to stay informed and up to date with financial news, make sure you subscribe to our channel and don't miss out on any upcoming videos.